Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Shelley Liebembuk, and I'm a professor of theater at the University of the Fraser Valley. And it is my pleasure to be here today with my friend and colleague, Art Babayants, who is an artist and scholar focusing in on the phenomenology of multilingual acting. And today we'll have that opportunity to talk about his research into multilingual performers and also look at its application for acting pedagogy. So welcome, Art.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Great. And I thought we could start with perhaps an overview of your research to date on multilingual performance. So please let us know how this all began and what the largest project that you've worked on looked like.
Yes, so I worked with a group of 12 actors who were professionals, semi-professional, and some amateur actors. And we were collectively devising a multilingual performance. So we didn't have a text we started with. We were creating texts in different languages. And all actors, all my study participants were got to perform in different languages. Specifically, they got to perform in one of their dominant languages, in one of their non-dominant languages, for example, a language they were learning. And they also got to perform in a language that they had never spoken before. After each rehearsal devising session, the participants wrote journals where they documented their lived experience of performing in different languages. And at the end of the study, when we produced actually a performance, an actual show in 12 different languages, at the end, I conducted interviews with each of the participants, focusing on the points they raised in those journals. And I did that all at the University of Toronto back in 2015.
Great, thank you for that overview. And I can share that I had the privilege of working on a later iteration of that project with you as a dramaturge, and again, got to see a lot of this really phenomenal work of engaging and experimenting with different embodied ways of working with languages, both dominant and non-dominant. And so I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate here for our audience on those distinctions around dominant and non-dominant language and the use of that terminology, because again, in colloquial speech, we often hear reference to a mother tongue. We often kind of reduce that in a multilingual, and also here immediately you've already said that you were working across lots of different access points to language, both for multilinguals and monolinguals. So I think that's a really wonderful and dynamic element of your research.
Yes, thank you for pointing this out. Yes, in regular parlance, we use the words first language and second language, and usually the assumption is the first language is your mother tongue, and it's the language that you know really, really well, and then second language is something that you learn later in life, and it's the language of the other. It's sort of additional. It's not as strong. There's basically something wrong with it, and while sometimes it is definitely the case, and with some of my participants it was the case, a few participants really resisted that sort of definition. And one example that comes to mind is a participant who said that her first language was Cantonese, her second language was Mandarin, and her third language was English, but her dominant languages were her second and her third, because at some point in her life, I think when she was about 6 years old, she just stopped using Cantonese and it wasn't really relevant to her adult self. And so she was still fluent in Cantonese, but her second and third language were more comfortable for her as an adult. And I think one of really wonderful researchers that I know about in linguistics, Aneta Pavlenko, writes beautifully about how the relationship that we build between our languages could be really, really, really complicated. She specifically writes about her first language, her native tongue, which is Russian, And she says that the words of the Russian language brim with familiarity and warmth, but at the same time, it is also a language of trauma because it is associated with the regime at that time, the Soviet regime, that was trying to obliterate her as a Jew. So, but her second language, English, is of course the language of her research, but it's also a language of her partner. So it is the language of work, but it's also the language of love, right? So English for her is a language of liberty at the same time. So our relationships to our languages are different at different points in our lives. So as an acting teacher or as a director, when you're working with multilingual students or actors, it's important to ask them what your current dominant languages are, what your current non-dominant languages are, and what's your level of proficiency in each of those languages.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, and we've spoken about this as well, that not to assume a certain relationality and affective relationship to a certain language. In my experience as well, English for me is my dominant tongue, even though it's my third language. And when I was in acting conservatory, I was requested by a teacher to perform in my first language under the assumption that that would allow me to access certain affective ways of emoting, which was not the case, but was assumed to be the case by the teacher who couldn't understand me in that language. So I think, again, it's realizing not only that the actor is going to have a complex relationship to language, as you said, but also realizing that as an acting teacher, as we're stewarding that process, sometimes we won't necessarily have the most clarity also in seeing that. So again, tying back to something that you mentioned at the top, that in this research you were having the performers reflect on their own experience and really allowing that to be a primary and significant part of the research process. Because again, as a teacher in that remove, you might not have the access to all of those details and not to make assumptions which can really compromise the value of this process.
And maybe just to add to that, that the interesting thing about performing in any language is that the performance itself, the experience of performing, might change your perception and attitude towards the languages that you speak. And I actually had 2 participants in my study that reported that by experiencing improvisation in their second language, which was really, really weak. They were not fluent speakers of that language. They changed their attitude towards that language. They discovered that that was actually a language and not a school subject. So performing in a language could change how you see it itself.
Right, that's a great point. So moving forward here, when you were asking the different performers, excuse me, to participate in these improvisations, if you could kind of talk us through how these worked. Again, how might a teacher trying to work through some of this multilingual possibility in their acting pedagogy, how they might do that, and some of the takeaways of that process for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not going to focus so much on how teachers could organize their improvisations with multilingual students, because I think it will depend on your own school of acting, how you were trained as a teacher. I could talk a little bit more about the perception of multilingual performers as they're performing in their dominant and non-dominant languages. And that was really one of those amazing discoveries that I didn't expect. Granted that I only had 12 participants, but some of the performers reported that they found improvising and performing in their first language very, very natural. It was very easy. There was no need to consciously control what they were saying, while performing in their second language required the subconscious control, and that distracted them from actually committing to acting. That was sort of expected, because you kind of think, yes, the first language is usually more dominant. But then there were also performers in my study who very clearly claimed that actually it was their second language that allowed them to have more liberty in performance, because for them, when they were performing in their second language, they were not themselves and they were sort of wearing a mask. Some of them compared it to a clown nose or to an actual mask we get to wear as actors when, for example, we do commedia dell'arte. And so the second language allowed them not to worry about the subtleties of the language because they were not that attuned to their non-dominant language. And there was more liberty in that sort of performance rather than in the language that was more dominant, more strong. It is useful for us to understand that languages are learned differently. And some multilinguals learned their languages through living in those languages, and they developed what we call procedural knowledge, which is when you acquire something through an embodied experience. So a good example, if you think of riding a bicycle, that's mostly procedural knowledge or procedural memory. Even after 10 years of not riding a bicycle, you will still remember riding a bicycle. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I hope so.
Oh, well, yeah. Same thing with driving a car. Usually those skills are remembered. That memory doesn't go away, and it's called procedural. Your first language gets stored in that knowledge a lot, and that's why you remember it so well. And the interesting thing about that knowledge, it's not taxing for your brain, and it doesn't really take up a lot of the working memory. So when you're speaking a strong language, usually your first language, you actually do not tax your working memory. But the second type of memory, which is called declarative memory, is this sort of like classroom learning. So when you studied science in school, that scientific knowledge went into your declarative memory. And unless it gets repeated all the time, unless it gets retrieved all the time, that kind of memory, that kind of knowledge gets forgotten, gets lost pretty quickly. So if I ask you some facts about, I don't know, like 9th grade science, you might not remember it.
Right.
But you would still remember how to ride a bicycle. And the difficulty with this kind of memory is that it is taxing for your working memory. So imagine if you're using a language that is mostly stored in your declarative knowledge and you have to act. It's already taxing for your brain to process the language, and I also have to act.
Right.
It's going to be very, very different if you're using a language that is stored mostly in your procedural knowledge, and languages are always distributed between the two. But if it's mostly in your procedural knowledge and you have to act, it's easier because the language processing happens automatically and it doesn't tax your working memory that you need for focus, you need for concentration, you need for reaction, you need for being in the moment as an actor. So as a teacher, I would ask my performers, how did you learn your dominant and non-dominant languages? Did you learn them in a classroom environment and never experience them in real life? Or did you learn them experientially through full immersion, for example, which means that the language will go into procedural knowledge? Mm-hmm. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of, I think tying into that, a question I have, which is linked to that, is that question of inhibition, right? Of inhibiting one language in order to perform in a second, right? And that's true for everyday life, but of course, in this context, we're specifically talking about doing that within an acting context. So I wonder if kind of switching to that, because as you say, obviously also sometimes when we've been taught a language in a classroom setting, not only is it kind of, does it tax more of our mental capacity in order to enact it, but often sometimes we're going to find that it's not as embodied or not as fully embodied. So I wonder, speaking to that process of inhibition and how, again, when you're looking to create active performance, which again, for those who might not be familiar with your work is very much, you know, it's three-dimensional. It's about the physical embodiment just as much as the linguistic capability. And that's important here, right? That it's not just a text. You did work to devise a text that is very physically grounded and multilingual at the same time. So I wonder if you could speak to that process.
Yes, so I actually didn't know about inhibition when I did my master's research many years ago. And I now know a lot about it. But one of the skills that you learn as you're learning a language is not just the language itself that you're learning, but also your brain needs to learn how to inhibit all the other languages that you speak. And your brain better learn it to do automatically without engaging, again, your working memory. So I'm speaking to you now, and you speak 3-4 languages as far as I remember, and I speak 3-4 languages as far as I remember, but the only language we share is English. So
Right.
your brain, as we are speaking, is automatically inhibiting the other languages that you speak, and my brain is automatically inhibiting the other languages as we speak. So the words and grammar and everything else, emotions from those languages are not coming, hopefully, to into our conversation, because the brain is automatically doing the inhibition. It's a skill that needs to be developed, and if it's not developed and you get a performer who is not used to performing in a new language or in a non-dominant language, it is likely that they will be using some of their working memory to inhibit their first language or their other dominant languages. And you could use that as an aesthetic choice and let them actually, you could allow those languages to come out, and that could be an aesthetic choice to mix different languages or play with one language, but while using the body of the other language or the intonation of the other language, which would be fantastic. Or you could go for full inhibition, and the learner and the performer will have to really learn how to adhere to the very, very strict pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar rules of the language that they're trying to perform in, even though it might be not their dominant language.
Thank you. And any other interesting observations here from this research? Again, you mentioned that inhibition wasn't something you'd looked at in the master's, then here in this dissertation project and moving forward, clearly it became a large component in rehearsal. Any other?
Yeah, another interesting observation was that also started in my master's research when I was working with non-native speakers of English who were performing in the English language. We were working on a text-based production, so they didn't have to come up with their own text. They had to appropriate the lines that were written for them. And it was interesting that in one of the rehearsals, I observed that as the more the actors got engaged, emotionally engaged, physically engaged by the given circumstances, by the relationship between the characters, the more they were involved in the scene, the worse their pronunciation was getting. So their level of English went down as they were getting better and better at acting. So it was really fascinating for me. And at that point, I didn't know why it was happening. It was quite consistent. Out of about 20 people, everybody's English went to the dogs as they were getting more and more engaged as actors, except for one person. And I was wondering why it happened. And I interviewed those actors, and that one person told me that he had learned English in a private school in Britain, while everybody else learned English in their regular, high school or middle school. And that was just a second language class that they were taking, just like people learn French in Canada, or in Quebec, people learn English. It's just a class. It's not immersion. It's not living in that language. It's not experiencing that language. And later on in my readings, I discovered research in linguistics on what is called emotional conditioning. And emotional conditioning is that when we are learning to mediate our emotions through a particular language. So for example, our taboo words sound to us, they could be icky or they could be unpleasant because they are strong. But taboo words in your second language might sound or non-dominant language might sound to you as nothing, or they're not important because you didn't go through emotional conditioning in that language. So what you could discover sometimes that the more engaged your actors get, the worse their linguistic ability gets, especially if they're speaking in the language that they learned through a regular, as a school subject. And not through immersion. It's nothing to worry about, it's just something to be aware of. It's not because they're bad actors or they can't hear you, it's because they had never experienced that language as a language.
And in its embodied capacity. And I think
that's embodied capacity, in
fantastic
emotional capacity. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, again, maybe tying back to the silly example I gave earlier on, when you're talking about using classical texts, that again, maybe as within acting pedagogy, to not only think about how then to engage performers in rehearsal in a way that allows them to have an emotive and rich and complex relationship to whatever language they're using on stage. I think, again, that's a real, very strong takeaway that we can take to different kinds of texts that actors, whether monolingual or multilingual, are going to experience and be tasked to engage with in rehearsal. So it's an important element, as you say, to realize that it's not a mistake and it's not an acting limitation. It's actually a matter of continuing to build forward an emotional relationality to that language.
Absolutely. It's something they have to learn. It's not going to be given to them. So they have to maybe learn it in the acting class. They will have to be emotionally conditioned in the new language, which is a heck of a task.
Right. Great. Thank you. And again, and kind of maybe to kind of round us off here, acting, of course, is kind of the broader than any one language, as we've talked, right? It's performance, and it's only one of the languages that the actors are using, both in your research on multilingual performers. Language is obviously a key element, but it's not the sole one. So I wonder, again, to kind of give you an opportunity, again, we've spoken a lot about the embodied element here and how significant that is in your work and in your focus. So if you could tell us more about how the body and the gesture come into this conversation for you.
Absolutely. Before I talk about it, can I quickly show you a few gestures and then ask you if you know what they mean? So if I do this gesture, what do you think it might mean?
No idea. Some sort of disrespect, maybe.
Okay, that's a good guess. As you know, if you don't know, you don't know. You start trying, you start figuring out, right? Let me try another one.
No idea.
Okay, well, let me try the gesture, which is different but has exactly the same meaning.
Drunk?
Yeah. So this and this are both gestures for drinking alcohol or being drunk. This one is from from France, and this one is from Russia. The point is that, as you said, language is linked to what we call gestures, or sometimes people say body language. I don't use the expression body language. I use nonverbal communication signs, but oftentimes people say body language. And the interesting thing is, when I was doing my research and my performers were trying to perform in the languages that they've never ever encountered before, which was probably the most fascinating part. One of the things that they reported was there was a big body and language disconnect when they were performing in those languages, because of course they learned the text. They learned a text in the language that they've never spoken before. They knew what the text meant. It was a short text, and they were trying to perform that text. But as they tried performing it, they also realized that their body had no knowledge of what to do with that text, because of course language comes with the rhythm. The body uses that rhythm. And language comes with what we call symbolic gestures. These are symbolic gestures, and they are only there if your body has acquired them. And so, bearing in mind this concept of the body language disconnect, you as an acting teacher or as a director, you could play with it a lot. The way we played it in our production was we had two fluent Chinese speakers, and I noticed pretty early that they had a very different repertoire of gestures. One was using the gestures that were more common in China, and the other one spoke fluent Chinese but used gestures that were more common in the United States. And we put them together on stage, and while they were demonstrating the same kind of meanings, they were doing completely different gestures. So you could play with this body language disconnect and see if you could find interesting aesthetic means of playing around with language coming from one culture and the body or specifically symbolic gestures coming from a different culture. And of course, there could be many other ways of using the body when you're doing things in a multilingual way.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.